In my opinion, a dress must have pockets. Of course, I couldn't make this dress without them. So starting with the pocket pieces, I pinned 2 pieces right sides together. Then I sewed the pocket seam right sides together. Repeat with the other pocket seam. Here I'm pinning 2 skirt pieces right sides together. And I sewed the center front seam of the skirt, stitching at the beginning and the end of the seam. Next, I start with the midriff front, then grab the 2 midriff side pieces, pinning them right sides together. Sew the seams of the midriff together, of course matching the notches. Time to attach the back facing. With right sides together, pin facing pieces to the bodice back edges, matching notches. With notches matched, I sewed the back facing pieces. Take one of the yoke pieces that's cut on the fold, lay it flat right side up. With the 2 yoke back pieces, attach them right sides together to the yoke front, matching notches. The best thing about matching the notches on a commercial pattern is that if the notches don't match up, the pieces most likely don't go together. I do suggest for beginners to strive to be consistent, including all the notches when cutting your fabric. It will help you in the long run to ensure that you don't sew the wrong pieces together. Repeat this assembly with the remaining set of yoke pattern pieces. Sew the sections of the color together, matching the notches. Sew the inner curve of the yoke, leaving a portion of it unsewn. I trimmed the seam and clipped the corners of the yoke to reduce bulk, then turned the yoke right side out. I eased the curve I just sewed by snipping into the seam allowance. Be careful not to cut into your stitching, but if it happens, just re-sew the seam. Turn the collar right side out, press with an iron. For the remaining 2 skirt panels, leave 6 to 8 inches of the seam unpinned down from the waist edge. For the remaining 2 pocket pieces, pin them right sides together. This seam is the center back of the skirt where the zipper will be inserted. So I backstitched several times where the bottom of the zipper will end up to reinforce it. And let the ironing begin. Ironing is my favorite part and one I never skip over. Properly ironing my seams ensures that the seam allowances won't be flipped in the wrong direction, and pressing the seams takes my garments from looking like a homemade hand-me-down to looking like a well but handcrafted garment. Pin bodice back pieces to the bodice front. Sew the side seams. like to serge seams as I go. With some matching thread, I tacked down the facing, ensuring that the stitches are not terribly large or noticeable from the right side of the fabric. I like to pull the gathering threads tight. Yes, tight. Then gently loosen them to fit. Pull tight the gathering threads for the bottom of the bodice as well. To then match the notches on the yoke to the notches on the bodice, finessing the gathers to fit evenly between the 2 points. Once I've gotten the gathers evenly dispersed, I pinned the ungathered portion of the bodice to the yoke. With the midriff, match right sides together, lining up the center notches with the notches on the center bottom of the bodice. I like to sew the yoke onto the collar with the gathers on top. So the machine isn't feeding the fabric under the foot. I'm able to give the gathers a final finesse to ensure they are positioned evenly. With right sides together, match the notches of the armhole facing to the notches on the arm side of the bodice. For the underarm facing, I sewed the facing right sides together using a 1/4 inch seam allowance. In this video clip, I'm serging the raw edges of the underarm facing. It wasn't too difficult to serge this with it already attached to the bodice, but just to give you a little heads up, I probably should have serged this before attaching it to the underarm. I clipped the curved seam, then turned the facing to the end side of the bodice, pinning it down. With some matching thread, I slip-stitched the armhole facing to the bodice. For the stitches that will be visible from the front side, I made sure they were tiny. For the rest of the midriff front, I pin it to the bottom edge of the bodice. But what I didn't realize until literally just now is that the 2 midriff back pieces needed to be lined, or at least the top edges needed to be finished somehow. Pattern pieces, so I dug out the midriff back pattern pieces and cut 2. I pinned it right sides together, sewing it at the top edge with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. To ensure the yellow lining doesn't roll up and be seen from the outside of the bodice, I understitched the facing to the seam allowance. I pinned the shoulder seams to the yoke, matching the notches. I snipped into the seam allowance so that the collar will lay flat. I folded in the seam allowance by a 1/4 inch, pinning it into place. And now for the fun part. Since I've sewn the collar and the midriff onto the bodice permanently, affixing the gathers, the blue basting threads have served their purpose. So I cut them, pulling them free from the fabric. I chose to hand stitch the collar from the inside of the bodice, rather than sewing it by machine, simply because I didn't want to see any visible top stitching. For the portion of the collar that goes over the shoulders that doesn't sandwich onto any part of the bodice, I used a ladder stitch to secure it. Turning my attention back to the skirt pieces, I serged the edges, the waist, hem, and side seams, but at this time I did not serge around the edges of the pocket. With right sides together, I pinned the 2 skirt pieces along the curve of the pocket and down the side seam. I've illustrated a diagram to clear up any confusion for this step. After sewing around the pocket and side seam, I serge it as well. With the largest stitch length on my machine, I basted 2 rows of gathering stitches in 3 sections at the waist edge of the skirt. Feel free to use more rows of gathers if you need. Be sure that you don't baste over the pocket bags or openings of the pockets. Here I'm pulling the threads to gather the fabric too tightly. Yes, you've heard me correctly, too tightly. I like to tightly gather the fabric, then loosen the gathers to fit. To me, I think the outcome is easier and is visibly more appealing. Finding the center front of the bodice, I match it up to the center front seam of the skirt and evenly loosen the gathers to fit the bottom edge of the bodice, pinning it as I went. So basically what I do is I match up the side seams of the bodice. So here is the skirt, and then here is a pocket. So the pocket side seam is going to be right here. So I'm going to match up the side seam of the bodice to the side seam of the pocket. And I'm going to pin it in place. This is only going to be temporary because I'm going to work on finessing those gathers. So I turn it to this side, which from this perspective is a little bit more difficult to do this for me. So I've pinned it right here, and I am going to loosen the gathers to make the bodice, which is right here, to fit within the gathers, because the gathers are too tight. And that's the whole point, is you want to gather your gathers down too tight so that when you loosen them, they will actually look consistent. Right, so I'm going to start scooching the gathers this way to make the gathers basically the same distance apart and have them be consistently spread out. So what I'm going to have to do is this over here, I'm going to have to unpin this just up to the pocket. I don't need to unpin it any further than that. And I need to scoot the fabric over to where it loosens all those gathers. And then this here should be the center front seam. So you're going to have a center front seam down the very center front of your bodice. So that really needs to be pinned here, and it really needs to kind of stay pinned so you make sure you get your bodice on straight. And I like to finesse the gathers both ways. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the side seam and I'm going to match it up to the side seam of the bodice. So I'm just going to go ahead and pull it and match it up, and I'm going to pin it. And I'm going to pin it differently than I would pin the skirt. So I'm going to pin it vertically instead of horizontally, which that's how I usually pin. So I'm going to take my fingers and push the gathers less tight, or looser, if that's even a word, towards the pin. And then now that I've matched up the bodice length, the length of the bodice to the less gathered skirt, now I am going to pin horizontally because that's how I pin, and that's just how I like to do it. Pin to secure it to the fabric, just of course so I can get it under the sewing machine. Alright, so I have my pocket, and I have my two seams on both sides of my pocket here, and this is like that goes around the bag. So I'm going to take the two seams and match them up, so that's going to make like a flat pocket. And then what I want to do is pretend this is equally gathered here. I want to flip it to the front. Okay, so when I sew this, I'm actually going to sew the gathers all puckered, and I'm actually going to sew just directly on top of the pocket, because I want to sew the pocket on flat. Of course, make sure your pockets are both pointed inwards, because when you insert your hands into your pockets, you want to insert them towards your stomach or towards the front of you. So you want to make sure your pocket flap is pointing inwards. So I always have a rule that I live by, and that's my darts are always pointed either down and in, right? And also my pockets are always turned or laid inwards. So down and in, and then my pockets are laid inwards as well. So yeah, that's how I always remember to correctly lay my pocket flaps, so that I don't sew them in backwards, so when I reach into my pocket I'm not having to dig backwards to get to my pocket. So, and here I'm sewing the skirt to the bodice. For the hem, I measured up 3 inches from the serged edge, pinning it into place. Naturally, the hem is a larger circumference, so taking it up by 3 inches is going to require me taking in a few tucks as I sew the hem.